Book the hearse, dig the grave, fill your bladders, the Labour Party's dead. Just Parliament don't know it yet. They're shambling on as a shell of themselves, but as Peter Hitchens remarked before the last general election, where he told you to vote Tory, the Tory party and the Labour Party are two zombies propping each other up. And once you take away one body, the other begins to fall. Now, there are a set of vested interests trying to keep those bodies in place or reanimate the Tory body, either under a new banner or try to breathe some life back into the oldest and most successful and now probably most hated political party in the world. Nevertheless, nothing's going to save the contaminated Conservative brand, and nothing's going to save Labour either, not even Andy Burnham. Luke Trill of More in Common did a focus group last week about Keir Starmer, and they asked, in a word or two, if anything, what would you say has been Keir Starmer's greatest achievement as Prime Minister? And the largest word in that thought cloud is nothing. Conveniently, that's the same answer Keir Starmer provides when asked, what's your favourite book? Do you dream? What does your internal monologue tell you right now? He was also asked, what were the biggest mistakes that the Prime Minister has made? Immigration, Mandelson, winter fuel allowance, and everything. And as far as adjectives to describe him, weak, boring, liar, useless, untrustworthy, bland, those that are still saying good and honest. I can only assume that Starmer is so inhuman that he's cloned himself and deployed said clones in the focus groups. But when Labour are taken out of their highly controlled environment, when the Westminster bubble is popped, what do the public think of them? Rachel Reeves decided to do a press stop at a garage to boast about a drop in fuel prices, which I'm sure we're all feeling as we have the highest energy costs in the developed world. Food inflation is up, youth unemployment is up, and we're still being substituted out by hundreds of thousands of third worlders every single year. Nevertheless, when taken out of that tightly controlled environment, she got a bit of feedback from a white van man who isn't too happy about the Labour Party abandoning the working class. And because she's never had an original thought in her life, her response was a perfect moment of accidental Alan Partridge.
Nigel Farage! You are Nigel! We're going to get arrested! We've got English flags on here, Rachel! We're going to get arrested! You're ruining the country! Get Keir Starmer out! Look, England flags! You're useless! Labour parties are useless!
I love our country, and one of the things about our country is good manners. Not very British. The news about the freezing future.
You know what else isn't very British, Rachel? Calling the entire country far right when they were grieving 3 girls murdered by an African whose identity your government colluded to cover up. Or calling the grooming gang scandal a bandwagon of the far right and delaying and denying and dismissing it as a dog whistle until promising to do a national inquiry and then appointing the head of said inquiry someone who tried to financially reward the person who previously conducted an inquiry for the Children's Commissioner's Office and also covered it up and blamed white men. I don't think those are particularly British or polite. I don't think you've actually done very much to be afforded our consideration, our grace and manners. I think actually our kindness would be taken by you as an act of weakness and a permission slip to continue destroying the country. But that candid interaction shows you just how hated Labour are among their former core voters. And I don't see Andy Burnham bringing that back, because he can walk along in Manchester to whichever Elbow and Oasis songs he likes. By the way, the Elbow song he used just so happens to have been one of the anthems for the 2012 Olympics in London. So we're getting the proper zenith of cool Britannia, multiculturalism, don't look back in angerism. Nobody's falling for this anymore. We know our country's falling apart. We know there are just random foreigners dispersed across every town and city in the country, making our neighbourhoods unrecognisable, unpleasant, unsafe, expensive. You can play Coldplay all you like, mate, but it's not going to happen. Andy Burnham is not going to save the Labour Party. So I wouldn't worry about him winning the Makerfield by-election. I wouldn't worry about whoever gets to sip the poison chalice for the next 3 years, whether it's Wes Streeting, Andy Burnham, Angela Rayner, Keir Starmer staying in, or Larry the Cat in Downing Street. They're all going to end up like Donovan at the end of The Last Crusade. They have chosen poorly. And Andy Burnham is not going to inspire Van Man, who is waving his St. George's crosses, doing something useful, feeling like he has been rendered a second-class citizen in his only country, the place that he loves. Instead, Burnham is still very much a member of the oikophobic Labour Party. He's the same sort of person as Emily Thornberry, who took that photo of the white van owning household flying an England flag in Rochester in 2013, pouring scorn on her own country and patriotism. More in Common also conducted a focus group about Andy Burnham's reputation, and there are a lot more positive adjectives in here. There's good, ambitious, popular, hopeful, northern and left wing, which is important to northern left wingers, I guess. But there are also quite a few people saying unknown, opportunist, boring, chancer, useless, arrogant. And I think those words will only grow if Burnham is in power, because at the moment the reason that he has a net positive opinion rating, he's the only Labour politician who does, is because he is a regional politician. He hasn't had to be culpable for any national decisions since he left Parliament after the Blair government were voted out, and he has received positive press because Manchester has become a hub for financial services in the last few years, mainly subsidised by the central government, the British taxpayer, through preferential borrowing rates. So Manchesterism, in as far as it exists, is still more borrowing, more spending on unsustainable infrastructure projects, more spending on subsidised housing, which is undoubtedly going to go to foreign nationals, which is one of the core complaints of Van Man, who already hates Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. And so if Andy Burnham is put in Keir Starmer's position, he's not going to change any of the incentives, any of the institutions that have put Starmer, even, who is a man of the system, he is a civil service in a poorly fitting suit, in a legislative straitjacket, and forced him to make these unpopular decisions like cutting winter fuel payments or trying to bring down the benefits bill to make sure that the entire system doesn't go insolvent, because the bond markets are cratering right now. Cost of borrowing is higher than it was under Liz Truss, who they keep blaming for crashing the economy. And if Burnham isn't going to address any of those fundamental problems, because he's not very competent, and ultimately he does believe in a high tax and redistributive welfare state, then he's going to be left holding the bag when, yet again, Labour have to leave a note to the next government saying, there's no money left. Burnham only has a net positive opinion rating, particularly among Northerners, because he could sit outside the Westminster system, criticising the Boris Johnson government for their appalling, evil, totalitarian lockdown conditions in Tier 3, but even then he was only complaining that furlough didn't go far enough for the tier system, and because he isn't to blame for any of these central government decisions that everyone hates, like immigration. And so I think a lot of these polls saying, if Burnham was the leader, Labour could win the general election tomorrow, they discount the events that would unfold under a Burnham government over the next few years. Immigration would still continue, he would still make poor decisions just based on instincts and ideology. He wouldn't be that different from Starmer. He's hardly charismatic, he's not particularly patriotic. He still believes in this sort of 2012, we're basically all fine Mo Farah multiculturalism. So it'd just be more of the same. And more of the same is exacerbating the problems. Because Keir Starmer's not that different to Rishi Sunak or David Cameron or Theresa May or even Boris Johnson. Keir Starmer believes in almost everything that they believe. He's just a salesman with a different coloured rosette. But because the system is unsustainable, because vice compounds like interest, because the timbers are creaking with a number of termites in them, the house is coming down on his head. And all that's going to happen is if he walks out the front door and Andy Burnham walks in with a new deed, well, the house collapses on him instead. So I wouldn't worry about this polling. I do not think Labour can win the next election. I think this is the last Labour government. They might salvage a few more seats than they did when it was projected that Wes Streeting would only win 4 and Keir Starmer would only win 14. But when you look at stats for leftoids here, producing this map based on the previous polling, I just don't buy that Labour would be able to form a majority government. I don't buy that they would win back most of the North. And the reason that Burnham can't salvage this is because the direction of travel is against everything he stood for throughout his entire political career. So YouGov did some polling on the 20th of May, and they found that Labour members see losing votes to Reform as a bigger threat than losing votes to the Greens. Andy Burnham cannot out-reform Nigel Farage, right? The complaints among Reform voters is actually that Reform itself is inconsistent on certain issues like immigration or deportations or Islam or the Iran war or the two-child benefit cap, or they've held completely incoherent positions on the same issue. Nevertheless, Andy Burnham has either done the same or has held a position that none of the Reform voters like. So, Reform voters complain now that the party is promising mass deportations, having not previously promised mass deportations. Andy Burnham will never promise mass deportations, so it's a non-starter. You're going to continue losing votes to Reform in the North because Burnham isn't going to have the money to bribe the North as he has in Greater Manchester anymore, and he's not going to be stronger in immigration than Farage, or anyone to the right of Farage. Burnham is, if anything, the death rattle of the Labour Party. It's like when you see a dying relative and they seem inexplicably revivified when you visit them in hospital, and then as you're driving home from the hospital or a couple of hours later, you get the call to find out they've passed away. That was their final lease on life just hours before death. That would be Burnham. And this is obvious from the concessions that Labour has already had to make on immigration. Because Angela Rayner and Labour's backbench despise Shabana Mahmood's pantomime immigration restrictions. Remember, she's developing new, safe and legal routes for more Muslim refugees to come over, sponsored by Muslim charities, housed at taxpayers' expense. She just wants them to not embark on the dangerous journey across the channel and have the objectionable optics of mass channel crossings in the headlines and on TV screens, but she wants them to come in a safe and orderly fashion nevertheless. But the extension of indefinite leave to remain is the key policy that Reform is relying on. Now, I don't think we should tie our fortunes to whether or not Shabana Mahmood and her soft-touch immigration reforms succeed. I think we should just promise, as a collective right wing, to send the Boris wave home packing whether or not they have indefinite leave to remain or even citizenships. Nobody wanted them here. It was a total betrayal of Brexit. You can easily revoke whatever paperwork that allows them to remain in our country and just send them on their merry way back to the countries they originally came from. That's totally palatable, I think. People want vast numbers of legal migrants to leave as well as every illegal immigrant deported. But Labour understands that the threat is posed by Reform, and so 44% of Labour members say we have to go ahead with Shabana Mahmood's immigration policy. We have to proceed with the rhetoric that Keir Starmer has used, schizophrenically saying we're an island of strangers and also to be British is to be diverse. It's an unsustainable position, but they've realised they have to concede to their rightward flank, because their members are going to vote Reform otherwise. And so this is why Burnham has come out, and according to allies, said he supports Shabana Mahmood's immigration changes, because he knows it's a non-starter to get elected in Makerfield, to get elected in the North, to become Labour's leader and Prime Minister, if he doesn't look like he is rescuing the tough on borders approach from being the property of Reform UK. One source said, for Andy, migration is a moral issue as much as anything. Showing people who've lost faith in politics that we do have control and we can do good. We need to tell a positive story about the contribution of migration to our country. More 2012 Olympics opening and closing ceremony bollocks. But we cannot do that unless people trust that the people they vote for have control over the borders. Yeah, they can control them and just open them, of course, as Boris Johnson did. You know, take back control meant that Boris Johnson has his hand on the gates and decides to open them and the invaders flood into our city. Nevertheless, Burnham is conceding on the narrative because the narrative momentum is towards the policies proposed by the likes of Reform and Restore, which is mass deportations, millions must leave, we're going to send the Boris wave home, and now the competition is who do you trust to carry out that agenda, not whether or not that agenda is palatable, possible, or an electoral liability. No. That's where the votes lie, and Andy Burnham acknowledges that. The problem is, Andy Burnham has a terrible record on immigration. He has a terrible record on pretty much all the policies that the electorate care about. He can't be trusted, and if politics is increasingly becoming a character judgment on who you trust to carry out the agenda being proposed by all parties, then Andy Burnham will fail that character assessment. Now he's telling the BBC, after the net migration figures were released, 171,000 net migration, but that's only because about 250,000 British passport holders left, and then a few more 100,000 third worlders left. But then 8 100,000 migrants, including over 600,000 third worlders, came in, so don't be fooled by the net migration statistic. But Andy Burnham is saying, oh, net migration needs to fall further. But this won't help him. Do you know why? Because the New Statesmen have been scratching their head today, saying, well, immigration's down, but why does everyone still talk about immigration? Why is it still the #1 issue in the country, according to Ipsos polling? Why does nobody care? Oh, it must be the public's perception is out of step with reality. And that is kind of true, because the public think that most of the immigrants they see on their high streets are illegal rather than legal. They underestimate the extent of the problem. And they also think that legal migration, according to a survey data done by Onward, I think it was 4 years ago now, is 70,000 a year rather than 700,000 a year at the time. However, the reason people don't care is because these people are here. And it doesn't matter if the inflow has reduced in net terms. It matters that their high streets are still full of random foreigners milling about in the middle of the day, making their children, their wives, their daughters feel unsafe, that there are dodgy vape and phone shops all across the high street, that they emerged from lockdown, and that they moved while staying in the same place. And so, unless, as this sign says, they're all sent home, this problem won't go away. The salience of migration is too high, especially because this is an issue which requires very little information to be perturbed about. So, immigration is a visual issue, like it or not. You can tell when people are around you that you don't recognize, that don't share your ancestry, that don't share your culture, that are behaving in strange ways, that these new businesses popping up in your high street, which has been desolated by the economic ruin of COVID lockdowns, that they are not serving you. They don't share your aesthetic sensibilities. There's never any customers. They're staffed by bored Pashtuns. They're sitting on their phone all day until someone walks in, speaks Farsi, and asks for them to facilitate an illegal boat crossing in the channel. People can tell that this is being done to them, and they can tell that these people weren't here a few years ago, and they shouldn't be. It's the same as saying Labour just has a comms issue because they haven't communicated that the price of fuel has been slashed. No. People can tell that their food shopping is more expensive, that they can barely meet their mortgage payments, that their wages have stagnated, and, especially young people, that getting a job straight out of university is nigh on impossible because, I mean, AI is a top-down pressure, eliminating certain make-work middle management jobs. And from the bottom up, mass migration has devoured, since the 2008 financial crash, 74% of all new jobs created. And Keir Starmer's busily signing new trade deals for more Indian worker visas. So people can tell from their own lived experience, from the pressure applied to their income, from the evidence of their own eyes as they're walking around their own neighbourhoods. People can tell that immigration and the economy are the core problems. And so even though net migration has been reduced by Labour, that statistic is an act of gaslighting. And as long as the people are still here, people will vote to send them home. And so Andy Burnham, by not sending the people who are already here home and just promising to reduce the inflow even more, is essentially saying to them, yes, your house is flooded, here are some armbands, learn to swim, I'll turn the taps off, and if you want to bail it out, I might consider a teaspoon. Just not good enough. As for the economy, Andy Burnham is pinning his fortunes on massive redistributive spending to roll out Manchesterism across the country, promising to build new council houses, which is undoubtedly going to go to Afghans and Somalians in the heart of Westminster. He's also backtracked on rejoining the EU because Wes Streeting pulled the pin on that particular grenade and tried to sabotage his leadership bid because Andy Burnham has consistently said that he wants to rejoin the European Union. Makerfield is an overwhelmingly white, British, working class, Leave voting constituency. That's why they're currently polling Reform. That's why Reform came in a solid second in 2024 with their current candidate, Rob Kenyon, with about 32% of the vote, before Reform were even a national force. And there's a particularly sour taste in the mouth of Makerfield residents as well, because Josh Simons was the head of Labour Together, and he allegedly tried to get Special Branch, MI5, MI6, to spy on journalists who were writing negative coverage of his think tank. He was also parachuted into the constituency, has no local ties, and blatantly stepped down. He admitted it in his massive post, announcing that he was going to resign as an MP, in order to allow Andy Burnham to run in what was thought to be a Labour safe seat, and then become Prime Minister to save the Labour Party. That's why Andy Burnham's slogan is "Vote Andy for us." Us being the Labour Party, trying to save Labour as an institution when men like Van Man hate Labour and want them annihilated, and they're quite right to do so. That's I think Reform is just a battering ram against the Labour and the Conservative parties who have betrayed our country for decades. I don't think loyalties are actually that sticky to Reform. I think Reform are actually still a protest vote. They're a brick through the Overton window. And Andy Burnham is, I mean, he's a man of the establishment. He was in the Blair government. He was an incompetent minister then. He's also very untrustworthy. There is a joke that Dan Tubb told as going around Westminster. A Corbynite, a Blairite, and a Brownite walk into a bar, and the barman says, "Oh, hello, Andy." So he's not going to win back the northern working class voters who want something substantive, different, action on immigration, and who are making a character judgment on the basis that you don't code as a member of the establishment, and Burnham does. And Burnham's problem is that Manchesterism relies on unsustainable debt and spending that the establishment itself agrees with but can no longer afford. Because the IMF have come out and said that Andy Burnham's spending plans, forecasted, would bankrupt the country. So Burnham has had to commit to the fiscal rules that Rachel Reeves has laid out, which themselves created an office for budget savings that spent millions on establishing the office and then closed down without having actually saved anything. Yet another Quango is currently borrowing more than expected and has shrunk growth to 0.1% per quarter. I mean, it's totally negligible. That's GDP growth, by the way, so that's just increasing the raw number of bodies and the raw number of transactions in the country, not increasing productivity, not causing innovation, not making GDP per capita increase among people, which is why we all feel so poor and wrung out like a dry towel for taxes these days. As it explains, sterling rose by as much as 0.7% against the dollar to climb above $1.34, while the yield on 10-year gilts fell back, following Andy Burnham's comments that we don't want to be in hock to the bond markets. Basically saying, well, we want to break fiscal constraints to spend more, and it turns out that if you aren't interested in fiscal constraints, well, they're going to be interested in you. The bond market expert Mohammed El Iran said, these comments from Andy Burnham contributed to this morning's outperformance of the UK bond market. So Burnham's own off-the-cuff rhetoric, his tax and spend economic instincts, even before he is elected as an MP, Labour leader, Prime Minister, are already spooking the bond markets. The bond markets are more volatile than they were under Liz Truss, who is blamed, unfairly, for an economic crisis and why everyone's mortgages are more expensive. The IMF have issued a warning about the British economy, saying that there's limited room for further tax rises. Turns out the Laffer curve does exist after all. They said the scale of rising spending pressures and limited tax base imply that a growing share of the adjustment will likely need to come from expenditure restraint in the longer term. Well, there goes Andy Burnham's plan to pay for subsidised buses and social housing all across the country, doesn't it? Burnham has no solution to why Labour are hated. His record on the issues that are causing voters to go over to Reform, maybe in Makerfield, some are even going to Restore. He's not going to be able to persuade them to come back. And so the polling that says Andy Burnham is going to be the saviour of the Labour Party, he's going to perform some kind of political seance. Not going to happen. And if this election is made on the basis of character judgments, Burnham keeps backtracking on everything. It's Brexit, it's immigration, it's the bond market, it's also his definition of a woman. He's now U-turned on his trans views, because he previously said that people who didn't think that a man in a dress should go into a woman's toilet is basically an arbitrary bigot. I mean, for audio listeners, you won't get this joke, but looking at the image in this article, I wonder if he's transitioning himself. I feel assaulted. Like, my eyeballs need to be bleached after looking at this. I'm just going to scroll down. He has now said the time has come to protect single-sex spaces for biological women after the Supreme Court made its judgment saying, yeah, women exist and you should probably keep men out of their sports and their changing rooms and their single-sex spaces like toilets and domestic abuse shelters. And he's gone, well, that the court has handed on high the evidence that I could have found in the GCSE biology textbook, and now we should keep blokes calling themselves Gertrude out of the toilet stalls with your daughters in them. If you can't make this most basic judgment, nobody's going to believe you, mate. Burnham previously refused to endorse temporary guidelines from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, By the way, Sundar Katwala, the grey squirrel himself, has just been appointed there. Katwala and British Future, his AstroTurf think tank that's the recipient of taxpayer funding that keeps saying that Britain deserves more immigration, has actually written the report that this dreadful New Statesman piece saying immigration is down, why does no one care, is based on. So we're going to get the same sort of recycled figures and faces in these quangos if Burnham becomes Prime Minister. Nothing's going to change. Anyway, he'd previously refused to endorse the temporary guidelines from the EHRC that stated public bodies should only allow biological women to use female toilets and changing rooms following the Supreme Court's judgment. And I'll just have to say, if you're going to call the majority of the country prejudiced and evil for wanting to exclude predatory men from women's spaces, from wanting to protect their mothers, friends, sisters, daughters from Buffalo Bill, then you're not going to persuade anyone. And as far as character judgments go, Christian Calgie actually had a run-in with Andy Burnham on the campaign trail, because Calgie was invited to follow Reform UK around and report on Robert Kenyon's campaign while Nigel Farage was doing the campaign trail. Apparently Farage wanted to stop off for a coffee, and they stopped in at a cafe, and it just so happened that Andy Burnham was in there doing a campaign stop, you know, posing with disabled kids, because the cafe runs some sort of charitable enterprise for disabled children to come along, do creative arts projects, have a cup of tea, and you know, they can look after their carers. Sounds wholesome enough, by the way. Calgie walked over to Burnham as they were leaving to have a chat, and Burnham's security shooed him off, and Burnham seemed to raise his voice at him, saying, "You don't get to come here, you don't get to intrude upon my campaign stop." Okay, buddy, if you can't answer a series of candid questions, if you're that hostile and defensive when a journalist comes up to you and you haven't planned for the interaction ahead of time, how are you going to handle international crises as a Prime Minister? How are you even going to handle constituency emails as an MP? Not being funny, I get stopped for photos and people saying hi to me randomly in the street, and especially at events. Like, I didn't attend the Unite the Kingdom rally. A couple of weeks back, I attended a conference that went on at the same time, and I happened to walk to Charing Cross Station on my way home, and Will Colesill of Vox Populi ran into me outside Charing Cross Station, mercilessly height-mogged me. I'm not actually that short. I'm not a Hobbit and he's not Gandalf. He's just something like 6'6", and I barely scrape 6 foot, right? He decided to doorstep me with an interview, and I just said, all right, yeah, fine, as long as I can contribute something of value. I did a 5-minute interview. I had a couple of drunk guys like throw things at me and interrupt the interview. You just roll with the punches. And if I can do that, and again, I'm just a guy yapping into his camera and writing on Substack from his study, if I can do that, how come the former cabinet minister, former shadow cabinet minister, mayor of Greater Manchester, and guy who's running to be an MP, leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister, can't handle a journalist coming up to him and asking a couple of questions about the by-election he's currently running in? A profoundly weak, effeminate, volatile temperament I just don't respect. And neither does Starmer, by the way. The Terminator himself has decided to lean into the Giga Chad meme, and apparently Andy Burnham's team have been begging Starmer not to come down and campaign with him because, I mean, he is just political nightshade. The man has a reverse Midas touch. Everything he is associated with turns to lead. Nevertheless, Starmer has said he will campaign for Burnham and Makerfield. A spokesman for Burnham said, "Anyone who wants to embrace Andy's campaign message is welcome on the campaign." Now that is diplomatic political speak for, dear God, we don't want this to happen, but we have to be diplomatic because he is the Labour Prime Minister and we can't outright come out and say, we hate Starmer and we want him nowhere near us. Because then we'll lose the actual Labour activists that bothered to show up and do leaflets for us. Starmer knows what he's doing. Starmer knows that even being seen in the vicinity of Andy Burnham will sabotage his bid to become an MP in the local area and therefore Prime Minister to replace Starmer. Giga Chad Starmer, chin out, saying, no, you won't replace me. Hang on, Keir. We all need you to hang on. You need to destroy the Labour Party even faster. Not that Burnham can save it, but better the devil we know, right? I mean, Keir Starmer is internationally despised, and so the longer we keep him in, the longer we speedrun the complete destruction of the Uniparty. And being associated with Labour is itself a liability for Burnham, whether or not Keir Starmer shows his face in Makerfield. There's a Times article here called The Myths of Makerfield that contains an interview with Robert Kenyon. It contains some polling, but it's only with 369 respondents. You don't know how dispersed they were across the constituency. This is before both Reform and Restore decided to deploy their activists there and do some doorstep leafleting. So the numbers aren't really to be trusted this early. But what is to be trusted, again, are the focus groups, because this is where you get the unfiltered opinions of actual voters. And the focus group members describe Starmer as odious, an absolute waste of space, and arrogant. And this has loomed large over Burnham's best efforts. The Times write, so far Burnham has refrained from attacking the unpopular Prime Minister explicitly, talking instead of voting to change the Labour Party. But some voters are yet to grasp that a vote for Burnham is a vote closer to ending Starmer's premiership. I would never vote Reform because they terrify me as well, Jackie, a retired Makerfield resident, said, which leaves me wondering what to do because I really don't want to vote for Starmer. And this is the thing, even if Burnham gets elected, the parliamentary Labour Party remains the same. Starmer will still be an MP. The same cabinet ministers and detritus on the Labour front bench will float about like driftwood between positions. It's just, to use a cliche phrase in politics, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Who cares if you're captain if the ship is going down? The clever Labour Party politicians could be manning the lifeboats by now. Though one such Labour politician who wasn't too clever was Wes Streeting. Peter Mandelson's protege decided to trip over his own ego by publishing his WhatsApps with Mandelson, showing that they were very close in discussing government policy, then prematurely leaked his leadership bid to Keir Starmer, couldn't get enough MPs to support him because, I mean, he's unlikable as a bag of gonorrhea, and then he showed up to Keir Starmer in Downing Street to threaten his premiership and then slunk off like the defeated male lion in the textbook, decided to resign as Health Secretary, and has squandered his chances of challenging Starmer for the leadership, especially if Burnham does get elected. He delivered a dreadful, tone-deaf resignation speech that nobody cared about, but I thought we'll sit there and dissect it, just to show this is still the mentality of the Labour Party. Andy Burnham, if he's elected, can't change this, so he can't change Labour's electoral prospects at the next election, and so Labour will be destroyed. And we just have to sit and wait it out for the next few years, and just tally up the damage so that can be reversed once we win a parliamentary majority.
I left the government because we are in the fight of our lives against nationalism. And it is a fight that we are currently losing.
Immediately, nationalism is the enemy. Nationalism, going by Bonajak and Ernest Gellner's definitions, is just a sense of solidarity with your inherited community. It is a sentiment. It is the belief that the native people of a country should control the destiny of that country. They should have an unquestionable possession of their own politics, their own culture, and their own territory. And they should defend that territory when threatened by hostile foreign invaders. If you disagree with that, then what are you? A liberal globalist? A traitor, perhaps? And Wes Streeting wears that treachery like it's a virtue. And that's why everyone hates Labour, because they see them as traitors. Hence Van Man heckling Rachel Reeves. Hence the feeling that he would be persecuted by his own government for flying his own flag. And you don't eradicate that feeling that you are being betrayed with more NHS spending, council houses, and songs by Elbow.
Unless we change course, we risk handing the keys of number 10 to Reform. And I do not want that on our consciences. For the first time in our history, nationalists are in power in every corner of the United Kingdom. Scottish and Welsh nationalism represents an existential threat to the future integrity of the United Kingdom. And Reform UK represent a threat to the values and ideals that have made this country great.
If the country's so great, why does everyone hate you? Because your values and ideals are ruining us, and your values and ideals are anti-nationalist. They're anti the British people. You think that political legitimacy resides not in the people themselves, in our preferences and prejudices, but instead you want to farm out sovereignty to quangos, NGOs, international bodies that do not have our best interests at heart, and think that our country is a refugee camp or an economic zone or a global bus station for anyone from everywhere who's on the make. And that's why nationalist sentiment is rising. Because even though Plaid Cymru and the SNP are treacherous globalist parties that want to displace the native Welsh and Scottish people from their only ancestral lands, people are voting for nationalist parties out of a sense of resentment from your government, Tories and Labour. Two cheeks of the same uniparty backside. Well, I suppose that will be a homophobic joke, considering Wes Streeting's making this particular speech. Nevertheless, the guy doesn't understand how much they are despised, and so if you don't understand the problem, you can't solve it, and so Labour won't pivot, no matter how much they pledge their allegiance to mild immigration reforms or fiscal responsibility. It's not going to happen. They still hate us, and that will be obvious in every action they take.
Values and ideals that are written into the DNA of the National Health Service they would dismantle, given the chance. Its very existence an act of courage as well as conviction, that healthcare should be provided based on what each of us need, not what any of us can afford.
Okay, and when you can't afford the National Health Service, who provides the healthcare? Because the NHS budget keeps escalating year on year, the bureaucracy keeps bloating, the wait times keep going up, the patient care itself keeps getting poorer, despite the best efforts of plenty of good doctors on the front line that, I've had to interact with recently because my wife's pregnant. If the system isn't working, just insisting that lying about it being the best in the world is an act of patriotism won't stop people from wanting it to be improved. And if they think that someone else is offering to improve the problems that are most obvious to them, whereas you are denying those problems even exist, then they'll vote for the person promising to solve the problems. And furthermore, you've already lost the boomer vote with the winter fuel allowance cuts. But among the boomers, pensions and healthcare are one of the top salience issues, but among the general public writ large, it's still the economy and immigration. The NHS is like third or fourth, so you're not going to win people over just talking about the NHS, I'm afraid. Non-starter.
Not just for the NHS, or even for the survival of this government, but to win the battles we thought that were long since won, of progressives against reactionaries, of patriots versus nationalists, of hope over hate. Yeah. That is our fight.
Andy Burnham's been doing the same thing. We stand for hope. We stand for good things, not bad things. Okay, but if everything that you're doing is making the country shit, then hope is just another platitude. People aren't falling for it anymore. The slogans do not gaslight them sufficiently to ignore the deprivation, destitution, and displacement that's currently happening to them.
Andy Burnham's fight in Makerfield, and it is Labour's fight for the soul of our country. Yeah. For too long, and for too often, patriotism in Britain has been left to the loudest voices and the narrowest arguments, as though love of country belongs to one tribe, one party, or one point of view.
That's because you can't even define what an Englishman is, Wes. And it seems like you consistently side with our enemies, not just you specifically, but the Labour Party writ large. So it's kind of impossible to be a patriot when you can't even define the people in whose interests you're supposed to be working and patriotic about. The etymology of patriotism is patris, the Greek for fatherland. So love of country descends from the paternal line. It is patriarchal. It is particular. It is based on ancestry. Whereas the Labour Party think that actually being British is about being diverse, which means not British, it's just a byword for non-white, and your entire government is replete with demented feminists who think it's a good use of time for the Cabinet Office to be monitoring Andrew Tate clips. Nobody believes this, because your actions are contrary to the platitudes you mouth when you're trying to win votes.
Because patriotism is not about who you exclude. It is about who you stand beside.
Okay, and in a war, you're not going to include your enemies in your battalions defending your nation. So you do actually have to exclude people in order to be able to define yourself. Otherwise, if you encompass the antonyms within a category, the boundaries of that category are blown apart and you can't even define the thing. Which is why, much like your definition of a woman, Wes, you would say a British person is anyone who identifies as British. Meaning, the very content of that category has been removed. Meaning, that's now a definition without distinction. Meaning, you cannot define yourself as that group if that group is not mutually exclusive from other groups. So yes, patriotism is exclusive.
Not rooted in fear of change or suspicion of difference. It is rooted in solidarity, in the belief that we rise or fall together.
You're right, it is rooted in solidarity, along ethnic and cultural lines. This is Bernard Yack's definition of a nation. Linked together by the vertical bonds of ancestry, from ancestor to descendant, so ethnicity, heritage, and the lateral bonds of social friendship and cultural solidarity. And you belong to that culture by inheriting it from your ancestors. If you break the vertical bond, then you shatter the horizontal bond. So yes, solidarity within the in-group is what makes a nation. You're saying we shouldn't have any solidarity with our in-group and instead should have an out-group preference, and somehow the nation will survive. And everyone knows that's just not true.
That is the best of our country's story. A Britain where people from different backgrounds, different faiths, different nations and regions still see themselves in one another.
Actually, I think the best of our national story is Richard the Lionheart, and Robin Hood, and Alfred the Great, and Athelstan, and the Empire, dare I say Guy Fawkes. I think our national story has heroes and villains, all of whom are British and cannot be substituted out by anyone random Afghan or Somalian who loves Britain because they can live in social housing and the police are so hopped up on anti-racism that they don't stop them forming a drill rap gang.
A country where the son of Indian pharmacists can become our first Hindu Prime Minister.
Via a coup, and then he was voted out because he was so unpopular that he gave the Conservative Party its worst defeat for 100 years. Is that diversity being its strength? Because it certainly hasn't been very strong for the Conservative Party's electoral prospects.
Without having his Englishness questioned.
Rishi Sunak is Indian, he's not English. He'll never be English, he has no English ancestors. The Indians celebrated Rishi Sunak being installed as Prime Minister as an Indian son, S-O-N, rising over the former empire. The ethnic chauvinism gives away the fact that he is not English and he's not considered English by his co-ethnics back in India.
A patriotism built not on blood and soil, but on shared values, shared institutions, and shared responsibilities. I understand that the SNP and Plaid Cymru will not see themselves in the English nationalist politics of the party that sits behind them. But nationalism is not progressive, and nationalism and patriotism are not the same things.
Wes is right, nationalism and patriotism are not the same thing. Nationalism is a raised consciousness in the presence of an existential threat posed by an outsider group, whereas patriotism is just a preference for one's own in-group. And so you must ask, Wes, why is nationalism on the rise? It's not because of the divisive far right manipulating people with misinformation, it's because you've imported so many hostile tribal minorities into our country that now we have a sense of ourselves because we are rapidly facing the prospect of becoming a hated minority in our own country. And this has come back and bitten you in the arse, and not in the way you would quite like, because you're about to lose your seat to a Gaza Muslim independent candidate, Wes. So, good luck, pal. You can keep delivering this speech all you like, but your ideology is just contra reality, and it's actually going to end your own electoral prospects and probably those of the Labour Party.
Nationalism says, look inward, protect your own, turn away from the others. Patriotism says, this country is strongest when we are confident enough to be outward-looking, generous and united.
True. And also, your party is fond of citing George Orwell, who would have despised you. But he wrote a book defining what the English character is after the Second World War, and he included within that suspicion of foreigners. So you're going to say that George Orwell wasn't sufficiently patriotic? Shabana Mahmood keeps saying that her patriotism is that of George Orwell, even though George Orwell would have laughed if she had said she was English, because she bases it on the line on the unicorn, and in there he says, how do you know a nation is the same 100 years apart? It's a bit like looking at a photo of yourself, age 5, on your mum's mantelpiece. You've changed, you've grown, but the features are distinct because you're the same person. And so a nation can only be the same if it's the same people, not if you substitute it out and then demand we still be patriotic nonetheless, Wes.
That is why we must reject the politics that tries to divide us, whether it's dividing the countries of the United Kingdom or the people who call Britain their home. The nurse from Nigeria is not the enemy of the factory worker in Newcastle. The family fleeing war is not responsible for the cost of living crisis.
Actually, they are, Wes. Most of them aren't fleeing war. And by the way, they have to have somewhere to live, and they have to have a job if they do work, or they go on benefits if they don't, which raises taxes. So yeah, they are the reason why things get more expensive, because we have a limited supply of commodities, and if you increase the population by 1% every year with hundreds of thousands of foreigners, most of whom never pay more in tax than they take out in their lives, then yeah, it is why things are getting more expensive. Oh, and yes, that Nigerian nurse is my enemy, as Russian Garbage Human posted below this clip. Excellent account, by the way, go follow him. Nigerians seem to be committing rampant qualifications fraud in order to gain entry to our country. So actually, I don't think we need any African nurses on dodgy qualifications. I think that we can train our own doctors and nurses up and pay them well enough, and then stop them fleeing overseas for better job prospects and lower taxes in Australia. I think that would be... It's no wonder that Wes Streeting takes everyone's side but ours and our own people's, because as Douglas Murray has written in The Spectator this week, in an article entitled My Encounters with Wes Streeting, which sounds a lot more suggestive than Murray intended, Douglas Murray mentions that Wes Streeting was the head of the National Union of Students when University College London student Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalab attempted to blow up a plane over Detroit on Christmas Day of 2009. Abdul Muttalab was actually the head of the Islamic Society at UCL, and he had invited multiple Islamic speakers to campus. One was connected to the Al-Qaeda leader in Yemen. Murray ran a think tank at the time and commissioned a poll from YouGov to look at the opinions of Muslim students on a range of issues. About a third of Muslim students said that killing in the name of their religion could be justified. That doubled among members of the University Islamic Society. When he was head of the National Union of Students, Streeting denounced the findings and the methodology of the YouGov poll before it had even been published, because for some reason, he was obsessed with deflecting negative press from Islamic student societies that were led by and invited as speakers terrorists. Murray then debated Streeting at University College London in 2010. Murray listed the events on campuses that happened during his time at the NUS. He then denied that terrorist speakers coming to campus might encourage students to do terrorism. Murray says, Streeting's not a stupid person, he's just an opportunist who wanted to harness the highly activist Muslim base in order to climb the pole of left-wing politics. After the UCL debate, I asked a left-wing journalist what he thought would happen to Streeting. Oh, he'll get a safe Labour seat and probably end up in the cabinet, maybe even Prime Minister, the journalist said. Then at some stage he'll start saying some of the things we're both warning about now. And where will we be? I asked. Oh, in some gutter, he suggested, breezily. And Douglas is right. Except for one thing. Seems that Streeting's own career is probably in the gutter for the foreseeable future. Though I suppose this does explain why Streeting, a gay man, allied with Jewish Labour and Peter Mandelson, wrote the Guardian article promoting the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims' definition of Islamophobia as a kind of racism back in 2019. As for other failed Labour contenders, well, Angela Rayner is currently being investigated as part of an election fraud row because apparently multiple fake independent candidates entered on the ballot for the Tameside Borough Council, which is in Rayner's constituency, Ashton-under-Lyne. Greater Manchester Police are investigating this. Basically, a couple of Labour candidates were elected after beating a second-place candidate, independent Ahmed Mahmood, by 177 votes. Other fake independent candidates, this is all alleged, by the way, received various votes between them, splitting the vote between Labour and Independents, allowing the Labour candidates to win. Apparently, those fake independent candidates had a meeting to arrange this scheme in Angela Rayner's kitchen. Seems pretty conspicuous. Why would you invite these people into your house to plot, Angela? But it could be worse. It could be the Green Party in the Makerfield by-election, who stood a candidate and then, a couple of hours later, he conspicuously withdrew without any word as to why. Maybe it'll be a consolation to Labour if we play while carrying in the coffin, things can only get better.